to the Cultivating Calmness Podcast. My name is Kaela Vance, and I have a question for you. Have you ever been to the doctor or another provider and received a diagnosis that you didn't quite agree with? Well, I know I have, and I know I have received information from providers that I didn't quite agree with, but I often experience this with my clients where I have been working with them for a while, or they come to me with a diagnosis and I don't necessarily agree with that diagnosis based on what I am seeing and what I am hearing based on my experience and my education. And that's happened several times recently, and so I just really wanted to talk about it. In the mental health field, and I believe in the medical field as well, we call this a differential diagnosis, when we are trying to rule out or make sure we have the most accurate diagnosis. So that's considering all the options, considering all the symptoms, any tests, any information that we can gather to come up with the most accurate diagnosis based on the information that we have. And in the mental health field, we have the symptoms that people give us, and that's pretty much it. So I could tell you that I'm depressed and I could explain all the symptoms to you of depression. Does that mean that you, the provider, are going to think that I have depression? I don't know. I could go to another professional and they may say that I do. We learned this a lot in grad school when we were practicing to be therapists. It was a lot of learning, how to differentiate between one diagnosis and another diagnosis based on all the things that you were seeing. And ultimately, we want to provide a client with the least amount of diagnoses as possible. So if all of their symptoms can be wrapped up under one diagnosis, that's the diagnosis we want to give. We don't want to give 4 or 5 diagnoses because they have symptoms in all the categories. They may meet certain criteria for symptoms in all the different categories. Does that mean that they actually have that diagnosis? What may be different, and what I feel is maybe a big difference between like the medical field and mental health field is, when you have something wrong with your heart, what do doctors do? They do things to look at your heart. They'll measure your blood pressure, they'll, what is it, an EKG? I don't know all the terms and all the correct terminologies, so don't hold me to some of these things. I am not a medical doctor. But, they may take scans, they may, do all these kinds of tests to get images, to look at your heart, to see the numbers that your heart is providing, the things that your heart is supposed to do, right? Or if you think you've broken your arm, you can look at your arm and see, like my son broke his arm and there was like a big dent right in the middle, and you could definitely tell his arm was broken. But other people, like I broke my arm when I was his age, and to my knowledge, you couldn't really see it, but there was a fracture in the bone. So what did they have to do? They had to take an x-ray to see if the bone was broken. They did that. They had an answer. They were able to cast it, and it was able to get better, right? In mental health, what do? Do we take brain scans of people? Typically, no. There are providers out there that do certain types of brain scans to see where the blood flow is in the brain and to see what the brain is doing and if it's functioning to its optimal levels. And I am just now learning more about that myself, and I agree with that and being able to do that. But in lieu of that, no, we don't really look at all of those things. And most providers don't test your vitamin D level to see if it's low, or your B12 or your iron, and many other nutrients that could be affecting your mood. But B12 and vitamin D are very common ones for people who are experiencing depression, for example, to be very low in those. And so if a provider, I can't do that, I'm not a doctor, but I often talk to my clients about getting those things tested. So if a psychiatrist, for example, or a doctor in the hospital were to test those things and you were also experiencing symptoms of depression and those numbers were low, those two things would match up, and that would not necessarily confirm, but would explain maybe why you're experiencing those symptoms of depression. Okay, are we on the same page? I hope we are. I hope I'm making sense. So A differential diagnosis is important to try to kind of rule out or get a more specific or accurate diagnosis. And the problem that I see as a mental health professional in the mental health field is that there is no one standard, right? If you have a heart attack, we know what a heart attack is. We know what a heart attack looks like. There are specific things that a doctor can point to say that was a heart attack based on all these numbers and statistics and images, right? Or we can look at your arteries and we can see, well, they're totally clogged up. That was a heart attack, right? We can't really do that with mental health. So I recently had a client, I have a client, and I've been working with them for a while, and they went to see a provider who, upon talking to them for a very short period of time, 20, 30 minutes, gave them a diagnosis that I did not agree with. My client did not agree with that diagnosis. And it worries the clients, it worries, other professionals, when we don't line up. And it's hard to disagree with another professional who's in your same field. But I do sometimes. Bipolar disorder is one of those diagnoses that tends to get thrown out there a lot for small people and big people. I see people online, in the mom groups, my kid was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and it really makes me scratch my head that a child, gets diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Is a very rare instance. That's what we were always taught, that bipolar disorder in children is very rare. I would agree with that. And I would also point out that children are known to have extreme mood fluctuations all the time. Why? Because they're children and they're growing and their brains are developing and they, are egocentric. Everything's, about me. So if I don't get what I want, I freak out. If something sad happens, I'm sad. If something bad happens, I'm angry. Moods fluctuate all the time. They can be very angry. They are, susceptible to trauma just like adults. And so, they can react in extreme ways if they are triggered by a trauma or a reminder of something. And it could look like a bipolar person, but they're a child. Even teenagers, right? Their hormones are fluctuating. They're going through body changes. They're going through life changes. They're trying to figure out who they are in this great big world. And, it's common for them to have mood fluctuations. And for a teenager to be diagnosed with bipolar disorder, again, I want to question that. Now, I can't say that in every single case that somebody, doesn't meet all the criteria for bipolar disorder. But with a differential diagnosis, what we're trying to see is, do those symptoms belong elsewhere, like attributed to another diagnosis, or would it be better connected to something else? And so I just wanted to bring up an example. There are 4 diagnoses that come to mind. Bipolar is one of them, where depending on what you're looking at, depending on what you're seeing as a provider or what the client is experiencing, it could be any one of these diagnoses. And are you attributing the symptom to the right diagnosis for the right reason? So bipolar disorder, which is the key features of bipolar disorder are that, they have a definitive manic episode and depressive episodes, and they have those fluctuating moods that last for periods of time, not moments in time, not, today I was up and down, up and down, up and down today. Although some will say that, that is possible. In most cases, a manic episode may last days, potentially weeks, at a time, and then they will either level out or go into a depression, which is where a mood stabilizer or other like antipsychotics and other medications are used to help those extremes. Okay, so those are some of the main features of bipolar disorder. ADHD, so that common is that inattention and that hyperactivity. So those are those 2 things that make ADHD stand out, but there are many other symptoms attributable to ADHD. PTSD, which is the identified trauma, negative beliefs, negative thoughts, cognitions, that hypervigilance, always being aware, always needing to know what's going on at all times, having flashbacks and some avoidance of negative experiences. And then generalized anxiety disorder, GAD. The key features of that are that excessive anxiety or worry, and a lot of those physical symptoms, stomach aches, headaches, body aches, because of the anxiety that they're experiencing. So bipolar, ADHD, PTSD, and GAD all have overlapping symptoms, and you could potentially have all of those. You could also just have one of those, or maybe two, depending on what you've been through. So if you have an identified trauma, you are more likely to be experiencing PTSD. However, not always the case. ADHD or PTSD can look like ADHD. Because of that irritability, the difficulty in concentrating, the restlessness, sometimes that impulsivity. It can appear like impulsivity, but maybe you are reacting to a trigger. I think I said difficulty concentrating, and there's probably others. But like when I worked with children, ADHD and PTSD could look very similar in children. But if you didn't know the history, if you just had a child in class and they were all over the place and they seemed very distractible and not paying attention very much, you may assume ADHD. But what if you found out that they had experienced, sexual abuse and were living in foster care and, maybe have something else going on? You may think differently about that ADHD. Now, could they have both? Yeah, that's possible. But it's also possible that the ADHD symptoms, the symptoms that you are seeing that appear to be ADHD, could be more likely attributed to the fact that they have trauma, and those symptoms that we think of as the ADHD, can't sit still, I'm impulsive, I'm easily distractible, I'm not paying attention, I can't focus, can all be PTSD. With like bipolar disorder, you have that impulsivity when you're experiencing a manic episode, but again, that could be ADHD, it could be PTSD. Having that irritability and mood swings, ADHD, PTSD. With generalized anxiety disorder, GAD, that restlessness, ADHD, irritability, bipolar disorder, PTSD. So all of these things can overlap. And if you aren't taking a thorough history from your clients, if your provider, if you're a client and you have these concerns, if your provider isn't finding out all of these things about you, all of your history, to get a good look at you, then they may not be getting the most accurate diagnosis for you. And I want the most accurate diagnosis for you. Now, I don't like to treat a diagnosis. I want to treat you as a person. I want to know what's going on with you. That's why I, consider myself a holistic therapist or a functional mental health professional. Lots of different labels and things, but I fall under that category because I ask about other things. I've had clients where, they've been diagnosed with schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder because they have hallucinations where they're hearing or seeing things that other people aren't hearing or seeing. But there are lots of reasons that something like that could happen. You could have like heavy metal poisoning. You could have mold exposure. You could have like an overgrowth of bacteria and things going on in your system. You could have parasites. Are we asking these things as providers? Are we trying to find out where are these symptoms coming from? They're not just coming out of nowhere. If you're depressed, are you getting sunlight? Do you have good vitamin D levels? Are you eating well? Are you eating things that your body doesn't agree with? If you have anxiety and you are afraid of a lot of things, are you drinking a lot of caffeine? Caffeine and anxiety do not go well together. There's many things we could talk about here, but I really just wanted to point out that there are lots of factors that go into understanding somebody's diagnosis. And I could be wrong. I will admit that, I'm definitely don't always get it right. And maybe I don't have all the information, or maybe I'm just seeing things differently than somebody else is seeing something. which, I guess makes mental health, and sometimes like the medical community different, is that, you could see two different providers. They could hear the exact same information and could come up with two totally different diagnoses, which is why as therapists, we have supervision, consultation. We can run things by somebody else. I know when I was in grad school, that happened a lot, and I was no expert, but some people had different strengths than other people. And in our like meetings where we would talk about what we were learning in our practicums and internships, we would come in and be like, well, I saw this person, these were all their symptoms, this is what's going on in their life, and these are the diagnoses I gave them, and So some people would have the long list of diagnoses, and then our supervisor would talk to us about it, like, okay, and do what I just did, right now. What, how can we narrow that down? Do they really have 5 diagnoses, or do they maybe have 2? And which 2 more accurately take into consideration all the things you just shared with us as a group? And so, like, I'm sure doctors do the same thing. They try to get feedback and understand and learn and, try to figure out what's going on with somebody. So with the differential diagnosis, that's what we're trying to do. And the reason that it was important to me to talk about it is because I've been seeing that and hearing that in my clients, in the community, from my colleagues, about just diagnoses that maybe just don't make sense. If they don't make sense to you and you're not okay with it, it's okay to get a second opinion. Not everybody is exactly accurate. Everybody's right. Maybe not every provider isn't going to treat you the same as the next provider. So if you know in your gut what you think is best, and we can get things wrong, or we're maybe not the right fit for you. So the dynamics there could be off. So I encourage you to seek a second opinion, to gather more information, to provide more information to other people so that you can get the answers that you need. Now this is different from like what people call doctor shopping, and I'm just trying to get the answer that I want to get. Obviously there are people out there that do that. I'm talking about truly like in your heart of hearts, like this diagnosis doesn't fit me. This doesn't make any sense. I want to talk to somebody else who's going to hear me. And maybe they'll give you the same diagnosis, and maybe you'll realize like, okay, maybe they were right. Or maybe they will have a completely different diagnosis and you'll feel a little more comfortable about what you're hearing and you feel like those things line up better. So just something to think about, whether you're a provider or a client out there, to really think about, are you gathering all the facts? Do you have everything you need to have to make an accurate diagnosis for somebody? Because a lot of people use their insurance, and if you give an inaccurate diagnosis, that has the potential to stick with them forever and affect their medical insurance and affect, their life in negative ways if it's not accurate. So that's all I wanted to talk about today. Thank you for joining me. And until next week, have a wonderful rest of your week.